before we get started, you have the couple of maps I send you, right?
I do.
Okay. So the first one, the Western Sahara one, you can, I'll tell you anyway at the very beginning, and then. All right, so we can get started. We are at 60, no, 50, 52. All right. So other people will join in as we go along. All right, so good morning, everybody. Hope you're all well. As you know, I think I mentioned it to you, my initial intention today was to address another regional issue after the Ethiopian crisis in the Horn of Africa that we addressed last week. Namely, the situation in Western Sahara, a vast and expansive area on the northwestern shoulder of Africa. If you don't mind putting up the first map, Michel, that is larger than the UK, but has fewer than 600,000 people. Now, here are, in a few words, here is a story, if you will, of that largely deserted territory. After the Spanish withdrawal from that area that it administered up to 1975, the Kingdom of Morocco, which lies just north of it, claimed sovereignty over the region, over Western Sahara. At the same time, however, a separatist movement of the Sahrawi ethnic group living in the region, called the Polisario Front, declared independence for the region. And thank you, Michel. And called it the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, everything that you see in yellow. The two sides, Morocco and this independent movement, the Polisario Front, fought on and off a war for about 16 years that ended in 1991 with a UN brokered ceasefire, with Morocco holding most of the territory. Morocco, as you see in green up north. The ceasefire agreement included, among other things, the promise of a referendum on independence, which was demanded by the Polisario Front, a referendum that never took place. While a number of countries over the years tacitly recognized Morocco's claim to the territory, none had done so formally up to now, that is, until Trump's administration a couple of months ago recognized Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara. And this decision might have serious political implications for the region and beyond, actually. And this is why I wanted us to look at this area, which is not very well known. However, in the light of the recent developments in Myanmar, former Burma, and because of the interest expressed by some of you last week in the developments, ongoing situation there, I decided to take it up instead today and leave Western Sahara for a future day. So bye-bye Western Sahara, you can remove it, Michel, and we're going to go back to Myanmar. But I just wanted you to know why I picked Western Sahara for one of our get-togethers. As regards Myanmar, called Burma until 1989, the last week events that some of you must have followed unfolded like a chronicle of a coup foretold. First, the Burmese army, also known as the Tatmadaw, warned about such a possibility over the past few months, hinting that a coup might happen there. In response, Western diplomats in Myanmar expressed concern, and the United Nations cautioned against the coup. Almost immediately, however, the army issued a rebuttal, blaming the foreign embassies and the international community at large for speaking with insufficient knowledge. But the diplomats' fears turned out to be justified. Early last Monday, as the new parliament was about to convene, troops were sent at a strategic location in the capital. Michel, if you don't mind, put it up the Myanmar map, to the capital Naypyidaw, which is the capital of Myanmar since 2005. It's brand new. Thank you, Michel. You can see Naypyidaw in the middle of large letters in the middle of the country. It was moved from Yangon or Rangoon, as it was known before, by the military in 2005. The rationale behind it being that Naypyidaw was more centrally located in Myanmar, that was closer to turbulent states. There are a couple of turbulent, like Shan up north, Kaya further down and south, and Kayin also south, where some ethnic groups created disturbances. So the military would be closer to those regions and bring some form of political and stability. And because it was less congested than Yangon, which is a commercial capital, if you will, of Myanmar, and the third city after Mandalay, which is in the center also of the country. As the pre-dawn putsch progressed, the military resorted to the familiar playbook of dictatorship, shutting down internet services, suspending flights, and detaining political leaders and dozens of others, including regional chief ministers, Buddhist monks closest to the government, to the civilian government, and former student leaders of what is known as Generation 88, who are the young people who rose against the army that year. Not to mention Prime Minister San Suu Kyi and the President Win Myint. Like previous coups in the country, the latest one was justified by the military in the name of democracy. Indeed, Myanmar's constitution allows the military to take power in order to prevent any situation that, and I quote, may disintegrate the union and or disintegrate national solidarity, or may cause the loss of sovereignty. In an official statement issued the next day, the military declared a one-year nationwide state of emergency and confirmed that power had been handed to the commander-in-chief of the Burmese armed forces, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. The military seizure of powers seems to have been carefully orchestrated. It was carried out peacefully, without any apparent violence. Indeed, by Monday evening, so as I told you, the coup took place in the night of Sunday to Monday last week. By Monday evening, San Suu Kyi was confined again in her villa in Naypyidaw, rather than put in a prison cell, and the internet came back online, if irregularly. However, 2 days later, on Wednesday, San Suu Kyi was charged with the obscure infraction of having illegally imported at least 10 walkie-talkies from abroad, an offense which is punishable by up to 3 years in prison. The charge laid against her recalls similar accusations brought previously by the military during the 15-year-old house arrest that she had undergone in the 1990s and early 2000s. For instance, in one case, she had her lockup extended because an American man swam up to her lakeside villa unannounced, causing her to violate the terms of her confinement. As for President Win Myint, one of San Suu Kyi's closest political allies, he was issued a detention order for violating emergency coronavirus regulations by greeting a car of supporters during the electoral campaign season last year. If found guilty, he could face also 3 years in prison and be deprived of the right to ever exercise any political activity in the future. But above and beyond these trivial personal charges, the fact remains that the military takeover unseated an elected government that was viewed by voters as the last defense against the general's total control of the country, and extinguished hopes that this Southeast Asian nation could someday serve as a beacon of democracy in a region of rising authoritarianism. As you can see, Myanmar is surrounded by countries like China, Thailand, who are not exactly the most, Bangladesh, who are not exactly the most democratic countries in the world, Laos. So that being said, the coup itself did not come as a huge surprise, as the Burmese military has made a habit of forcefully removing from power political rivals and critics. Back in 1962, the army staged its first coup, a bloody exercise at the time that paved the way for nearly 5 decades of iron-fisted direct rule and international isolation. The generals ordered the massacres at the time of pro-democracy demonstrators and dispatched soldiers to chase members of ethnic minority groups, including the Rohingyas. Now, the Rohingyas, you see the map of Myanmar. On the left-hand side, near the Bay of Bengal, you see the state of Rakhine in yellow. That's where the Rohingyas live, or I should say, that's where they should be living, or they have lived, because as you know, the numbers are debated actually, but around 600,000 most likely have left the Rakhine province to find refuge in Bangladesh, which is a Muslim country, and where they live in tents for the past couple of years or so. Since this Muslim minority, as you know, has been discriminated against for decades by successive governments in Burma, which do not recognize the Rohingyas as citizens of Burma. And as you know, Burma is a Buddhist majority country, and the Rohingyas are Muslim, and the government never recognized their human rights, and they were also always considered as foreigners in Burma first, and then in Myanmar afterwards. And even when the junta started giving a civilian administration some space to operate, it ensured that the army would still control much of the economy and political sphere. That was back in 1962, as I said. Now, in 1988, when unrest over economic mismanagement and political oppression by the military-backed government led to widespread pro-democracy demonstrations throughout the country, again, security forces killed thousands of demonstrators, and the generals staged a coup d'etat and formed the so-called State Law and Order Restoration, a body which a year later declared martial law after widespread protest. Then 2 years later, in 1990, the generals annulled the first truly representative elections. They had previously allowed, actually, after San Suu Kyi's party won a large parliamentary victory, placing her, as I said earlier, placing San Suu Kyi under house arrest for 15 years. This year, in 2021, the military and its supporters were opposing the convening, as I mentioned earlier, of a new parliament, which they claim is not representative, arguing that the last November election that saw San Suu Kyi's party, which is called the National League for Democracy, win by a landslide. So the generals are claiming that those elections were actually fraudulent because of an alleged mismatch between the electoral rolls and votes cast. But the alleged and unproven electoral fraud is not what obstructed Myanmar's path to democracy. Obviously, it was just a pretext. What really caused it? It is a long-standing civil-military tensions that were allowed to fester. Let me explain. Back in 2010, a raft of political, economic, and administrative reforms were undertaken by the military-backed government for reasons which are still debated today. These reforms included the release of pro-democracy activists, including San Suu Kyi from house arrest, and subsequent dialogue with her, establishment of a National Human Rights Commission, general amnesties of political prisoners, institution of new labor laws that allowed labor unions and strikes, relaxation of press censorship, and so on. Needless to say that at the time, the international community welcomed, obviously, these reforms with great satisfaction. One of the immediate results of this satisfaction was Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's visit to Myanmar in 2011, followed by that of President Obama himself a year later, in 2012. The first US president to visit Myanmar. The same year, 2012, San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy was allowed to participate in by-elections, winning in a landslide, with San Suu Kyi herself gaining a seat in the lower house of the Burmese parliament. Burma has a bicameral legislature, an upper parliament and a lower parliament. What the international community seems to have overlooked at the time, or had no choice to do otherwise, is that prior to any reform, the generals made sure that the limits of Myanmar's democratic transition, as they called it, were inscribed in the country's constitution, a document designed explicitly to safeguard the military's power and prerogatives. Drafted by the junta and approved in a flawed national referendum in 2008, the constitution guaranteed the military control of a number of powerful ministries and a quarter of the seats in parliament, which in facto guaranteed that the army would have control of any amendments to the charter. The constitution also contained a provision barring San Suu Kyi from serving as president of Myanmar on the basis that she was once married to a foreign citizen. Actually, she had been married all those years when she was in house arrest to a British academic who's dead today, who passed away. These constitutional provisions essentially locked the long-standing struggle between the League for Democracy and the military into the country's constitutional architecture. What's more, the narrative of democratization in Myanmar never quite matched the facts on the ground, as Myanmar's civilian leaders themselves also struggled with the consequences of more than a century of British colonial rule and 6 subsequent decades of civil war and military dictatorship. Among these was the country's long-standing racial and religious divides, as I mentioned to you. The Rohingyas are not the only ethnic group which is being discriminated in Myanmar. It's an ethnic group which received probably the most publicity, but there are a number of states it disappeared. All of a sudden, I had nothing on the screen.
Oh, well, we missed you.
You were
No,
all
I didn't check out myself.
Oh, we're glad you're back.
Okay, so
we actually thought one of those governments that you were talking about maybe were silencing you.
Oh,
what do you mean the Burmese government? Could very well be. Could very well be.
The
Okay,
military is after you.
Yeah.
if you remember what I was before, we go back.
Yes.
Michelle, if you can put up the map again, please. So instead of addressing those issues head on, the reforms initiated in 2011 deliberately sidestepped them, exacerbating the tensions between the League for Democracy, San Suu Kyi's party, and the military. Aware of this delicate and very unfavorable balance of power, thank you, Michelle, the democratic parties and movements sought to respect the status quo in order to avoid at any cost a direct confrontation with the military. For instance, even after San Suu Kyi became a global democracy icon, even receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991 while under house arrest, and even after her release from house arrest, and she made sure that not to antagonize the generals, reminding everybody that her father had founded the Burmese army, and as such, all the soldiers were her kin. Well, needless to say, those remarks didn't go down very well, came as a shock at the time, particularly for those who had been tortured and arrested for years. And later, when she became prime minister, she refused to openly and publicly condemn the brutal military campaign against the Rohingya when that became public, and denounced the gradual erosion in Myanmar of civil liberties and the increasingly frequent detentions of journalists. By essentially becoming the face and the voice of the Myanmar army, San Suu Kyi destroyed, obviously, part of her international credibility, while still believing that the favors she did the army at the time may be rewarded someday and real democracy could be restored in Myanmar. Well, it did not work out that way. The last straw came in November, with San Suu Kyi's party resounding victory in the general election. Her candidate swept 83% of contested parliamentary seats. As I told you, 1/4 of those seats are automatically assigned to the military or the military-backed parties. Only 7% to the military-backed party back in November. Across the country, the pro-military lawmakers, many of them former commanders, lost their parliamentary seats to the benefit of the League for Democracy candidates, even in regions considered up to then as military strongholds. Now, that disastrous performance apparently shook the confidence of the army in its ability to prevent constitutional reform, endangering, obviously, its grip on power. It also complicated the plan of the army commander-in-chief and de facto ruler, General Leng, to run for president after his mandatory retirement from the army takes effect this coming July, when he turns 65. Since the president in Myanmar is elected by the parliament, which was now in the hands of the opposition of the League for Democracy. But while it is possible that the general could have come up with an extra legal path to power, regardless of the lack of support in the parliament, it is also conceivable that the army decided to take a shortcut and do what it does best, grab power and install a puppet government, which would then call for new parliamentary elections. Now, the domestic response to the putsch has been increasingly vocal. It started out with some work stoppage here and there, and also with ordinary citizens banging pots and pans or honking their horns in the streets of the Burmese city as a way to chase the demons, in other words, the generals. Since Friday, however, this disobedience campaign took a turn, became increasingly, as I said, vocal, with large demonstrations in most cities in Myanmar, with thousands of people protesting the takeover. And also the lawmakers from the National League for Democracy, who are being confined to their living quarters by soldiers, issued a statement saying that they still supported San Suu Kyi and President Min, and rejected suggestions that they had been relieved of their legislative duties. But it is not so much the internal opposition that will bother the military. It is international reactions. The generals have calculated that this was a good time to organize a putsch because they could get away with the takeover at a time when the new US administration is just settling in, at a time when China is busy with its own priorities and his own issues in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and with India. At a time when the European Union is in flux, as you know, with the Brexit, and the world is focused on combating the pandemic. At a time when San Suu Kyi no longer captures the global imagination as she did during the 90s because of her positions on different issues. And generally speaking, at a time where the generals believed that there would be less of a pushback in a global political environment where authoritarian governments have considerably increased their influence worldwide. That was obvious actually at the United Nations, where the Security Council, which had been convened last week to adopt a strong-worded statement, resolution, condemning the coup, couldn't do better than issue a watered-down statement expressing its concern about the state of emergency in Myanmar and calling for the release of those arrested. Now, the military takeover in Myanmar presents a dilemma for President Biden's administration. While the general assault on the country's democratic process triggered a relatively strong response from Washington, with the State Department calling the military's takeover a coup d'etat, a label that may affect some American foreign aid to Myanmar, and with the White House urging the generals to reverse course and respect the results of last November elections, and to release the leaders who have been detained, including San Suu Kyi. The reality is that the United States is not the dominant moral arbiter in world affairs that it once saw itself to be. And other forces in Myanmar could test President Biden's ability to forge coalitions to tackle foreign policy challenges that he had promised to do during his campaign. Biden's foreign policy team knows the Myanmar challenge very well, since many of its members dealt with it under the Obama administration, including Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, who is now National Security Advisor and who was Hillary Clinton's Deputy Chief of Staff and Head of Policy Planning, and Kurt Campbell, who's a former Assistant Secretary of State and who now leads China policy at the National Security Council. Back then, the United States strategy vis-à-vis Myanmar was to apply the right mixture of pressure, such as imposition of economic sanctions, and encouragement. In other words, working with democratic forces in the country, with San Suu Kyi particularly, and delivering assistance in exchange for reforms. A decade later, however, this strategy is in ruins. San Suu Kyi is not only back in detention, but her international reputation, as I said, is badly tarnished. Some Myanmar experts believe that confident in her, or overconfident in her domestic popularity, she might have overestimated her political strength and made too many demands on the general, particularly on the commander-in-chief, General Yang. Now, the Biden administration may be tempted to start the whole cycle over again. threatening new sanctions on Myanmar, except that this time, the old playbook may not work again, if it ever did before, because the US and other Western countries applied sanctions on Myanmar for decades with very little progress towards democracy. And also because Myanmar has changed significantly in the past decade or so. While China remains Myanmar's largest trading partner, its biggest foreign investor last year, for instance, was Singapore. Japan, South Korea, and Thailand have also poured money into the country, making it less isolated than it was during the decades of military rule, as evidenced on the diplomatic stage. For instance, while leaders in Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia have all expressed concern about the coup, the Philippine government, for instance, called the military action a chess move, while the Cambodian leadership refused to be drawn on what it deemed Myanmar's internal affairs. Other member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations have taken the same line. The coup poses challenges of its own for China, whose President Xi Jinping has cultivated close political ties with San Suu Kyi and her party. As Myanmar's civilian leader, San Suu Kyi visited China more than any other foreign country. And the Chinese leader, Chinese President Xi, went to Myanmar in January of last year, his last foreign trip actually before the coronavirus pandemic froze most travel, and signed a flurry of agreements, including railroad and port projects that are part of China's Belt and Road program to expand its military, its economic corridors to the Indian Ocean. The fate of such projects is now very much hanging in the balance. It is no longer dependent on a friendly civilian government, but on a bunch of generals who have always harbored suspicious feelings toward Beijing. Why? Basically for two reasons. First, because many of the Burmese high-ranking officers have spent their formative years fighting communist rebels in Myanmar, who at the time received generous, if covered, funding from Beijing. While ethnic insurgents are no longer part of the socialist brotherhood of that era, they still receive weapons and tactical support from China. And as a matter of fact, during Xi's visit to Myanmar last year, the military complained to him about it. And also because Myanmar's generals have historically always preferred international isolation to any whiff of dependence on a foreign country, even a country like China. For instance, when Western economic sanctions hurt Myanmar in the 1990s, instead of turning to Beijing for help, the military began, on the contrary, to plan economic liberalization and diversification intended to free it from dependence on Chinese largesse, and even defied its powerful neighbor in recent years by canceling or suspending a number of Chinese-funded projects that the Burmese generals found too costly politically. That being said, the Chinese government obviously sees the coup as a moment of opportunity to undercut the inroads the US and other Asian nations are making during Myanmar halting democratic openings, giving China more leverage to shape events than any other nations. This is probably why the Chinese envoy at the United Nations described the coup at the meeting last week as a cabinet shuffle, and why, despite the economic agreements it reached with San Suu Kyi, China has not signaled support for her, believing that there was little chance that the coup will be reversed. Because when push comes to shove, China's relationship with Myanmar is not so much dependent on who is in power, since whoever is in power has to deal with China, has to work with China. Look at the border. China is one of the largest, second largest economy in the world. So Myanmar cannot just avoid totally working with China. Plus, it's a neighbor. It doesn't depend so much on who's in power in Naypyidaw, but on the quality of the partnership and the cost that China has to carry for it. But at the end of the day, the real cost of the coup will be borne by Myanmar's long-suffering people, whose collective desire for a representative democracy has been thwarted once again. For their sake, the international community should do what it can to help restore the democratic process. Now, whether it has the will or the ability or the capacity of doing so remains very much to be seen. So that is the situation today in Myanmar. And so far, again, with all these demonstrations of yesterday, the foreign correspondents who are there report that there has been no violence and no crackdown besides the one that I mentioned to you, the arrest of a number of political leaders and cutting off internet and cutting off flights to abroad. But there has not been, the military has been relatively moderate in its reaction to the demonstrations. No spectacular crackdown yet. So the only influence I believe that other countries might have on the generals would be to try and put pressure on them to release the prisoners, but I don't know how much influence other countries will have on them to reverse course and to go back to the way things were last week. Because once again, these generals, as I mentioned to you, are in that country are used to actually isolation, if that's what it takes. They have this bunker type of frame of mind, and they don't mind, they prefer to be isolated, including economically, than to have to give in to any type of foreign influence, including the Chinese. So we'll see how things will be progressing in the next few days and weeks. This way, you have a better understanding of, I guess, historically also, of what's happening in Myanmar. All right, after this long presentation interrupted, I take your questions on any subject that crosses your mind, including Myanmar. From Barbara. President Biden says he's keeping a close eye on the situation. Everybody does, Barbara. Do you think we are really that interested other than from a humanitarian perspective? No. To put it simply, no. It's not an area of national interest for the United States, number one. And even if it were, I don't know how much influence the United States has on Myanmar at all. Once again, I believe that the reason why the generals allowed democratic reforms 10 years ago or 12 years ago, and by releasing San Suu Kyi for prison, it is not under US pressure. It is because I believe, as I mentioned shortly, I believe that they are afraid of having to deal face-to-face with China. And it's what it represented economically and politically. And they said to themselves, okay, we're going to democratize the country just a little bit, which will give us a little more opening to the Western democracies. So we won't have to rely only on China. There will be other countries like the United States or the European Union who are going to help us economically. Let's give the civilian government and all the NGOs and humanitarian associations, let them work legally in Myanmar so that we won't have to face the Chinese on one-on-one situation. So no, I do not believe that that Biden keeps a close eye on the situation. Most likely, I mean the State Department, most likely. But that's about the extent of what the United States can do in Myanmar at this time. From Judy, how has the pandemic affected all of this political turmoil, not plot, all of this political turmoil? I don't think, okay, I'm back on the screen. I don't think it has affected the situation in Myanmar, or it played any role in the decision of the military to take over. I don't know what the situation of the virus is in Myanmar itself. There are no numbers and statistics coming out of that country. So it's very difficult, except for the official ones, which report very few cases of the contaminated people. That being said, I don't know how reliable those numbers are, or I don't know how capable is Myanmar to face this crisis. it's a relatively large country. It has over 50 million people. But as I said, there are some issues in different parts of the countries along the ethnic lines. And I'm sure that if and when they start vaccinating people, whenever that is, the Buddhist majority will have definitely priority over all the other ethnic groups in Myanmar. From Donald, how important is it for China to have an outlet to the Bay of Bengal and India? Very important. To the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. Very important. And as a matter of fact, it's so important that... hello? It is so important that China has decided to develop a port in the Bengal Bay, just across from India, overlooking, by the way, 2 Indian naval facilities, which concerns very, very much the government in Delhi. India is one of the countries also which is looking at the Chinese expansion into Myanmar with a lot of concern, wondering, not wondering, they know exactly why China is interested in Myanmar. But the only thing in a way that reassures the Indians is that, again, the generals are very reluctant to depend on China. And as I mentioned earlier, a number of Chinese-funded projects have been canceled. Ironically, San Suu Kyi, who was a pro-democracy activist, had been much closer to the Chinese government, and the Chinese government has cultivated San Suu Kyi a lot because she was much more open to the economic assistance that China would give Myanmar to develop than the generals, who held back because, once again, they are very suspicious of what China is trying to do in Myanmar. This is, again, one of the reasons why the Chinese, who for years cultivated San Suu Kyi, have not said a word about her fate, now being in house arrest. While the other Western European countries, which had not been so, whose public opinion anyway, had not been taken with San Suu Kyi lately in the past 3 or 4 years, they have been putting out statements to the effect that San Suu Kyi should be released immediately and reinstated as her official function is state counselor, which is prime minister basically. But as I mentioned to you, she cannot run for the presidency since the law stipulates that someone who's been married to a foreign citizen cannot apply to the presidency. That provision was drafted with her in mind. So it's very important for China, to go back to what you're saying, Donald, to have to implement their policies in Myanmar. Myanmar is very important to them, but they have to be very careful about the way they do it, because now with the military generals in charge. From Peggy, what's the difference between Gulf and Bay of Bengal, Gulf of Thailand? Well, India is on one side and Thailand is on the other one. But it's still it's the Indian Ocean for both of them. It's the geographic nomination. But
I just mean the difference between the two terms, a bay and a gulf. Are they different, or are they basically the same?
I'm trying to think how to. Well, I really, I never thought about it actually. To me, a gulf, it's like it's water running between two areas of land. That's a gulf, separating waterways separating two areas of land, and the bay is open, and there is nothing there is nothing close to it on the other side. It's an open sea. That's the difference. But nothing else in terms of India and Thailand are on different sides of Myanmar. One is separated just by a waterway, so it's a gulf, and the other one is a bay, which is the shore, actually. I don't know if it's clear. It's just the shore.
Pierre, it says the technical terms Gulf and Bay are the same thing. The only thing that differentiates them is the size.
Yeah. Well, when I said the Gulf is narrower, you know, when the waterway between the land is narrower, and the bay is more open. It's like
right. That's what they say according to.
Yeah, but that's a difference.
Yes.
From Sherry, based on how this has played out, it seems unlikely that the UN or any individual country would choose to interfere with the sovereignty of Myanmar. The only trigger that might get the world to act might be even greater atrocities against the Rohingya, although it's hard to believe it could be worse. What are your thoughts about it? Well, it could be worse. It can always be worse. That I know from history. It can always be worse. It won't be worse with the Rohingya because most of them left. There are still refugees in the Rakhine state. There's refugees. There are still Rohingyas there, but most of them are in Bangladesh. So it won't get any worse. And those who stayed are changing their names to Buddhist names, and they are complying more or less with the rules. Actually, the reason why the generals are chasing the Rohingyas out of the country is because the Rohingyas resisted to different changes that the Buddhist monks asked the government to take against them. Because you have to realize that most of the Burmese society, most of the Burmese people are very hostile to the Rohingya. It's not only the generals who do it out of their, no, they just represent what the majority of the country wants. And as a matter of fact, while San Suu Kyi's defense of the military in that respect has tarnished her reputation overseas, abroad, it strengthened her popularity back home. You should look at it that way. So it's not that this is a policy undertaken by the military which is unpopular in Burma. On the contrary, most of the Buddhist leadership in Burma, Myanmar, Burma, agrees with the fact that the Rohingyas are not Burmese, really, and they should go back where they came from several hundred years ago. And Bangladesh is a convenient neighbor next door because it's a Muslim country. So to answer, that's your second part of the question. The first part of the question is unlikely that the UN does anything. Well, you could tell from what I mentioned earlier is that the UN didn't even present a resolution to be adopted by the Security Council last week because they knew ahead of time. China said before any statement was even approved, as you know, there are 15 member states that make up the Security Council, the 5 of them permanent, obviously, and they have the right of veto. So out of the 5, China, assisted by Russia, actually, they said they're going to veto any resolution condemning the military. So it was dead on arrival. So the only thing they could come up, again, was a watered down resolution. And obviously the UN will not do anything. Will they? The UN, again, does not have its own army, does not make its own decisions. The UN is what member states want to do with it. So as long as China and Russia do not care about the Rohingyas, and frankly, nobody else does, in that respect, the military in Myanmar has nothing to fear, nothing to worry about. The only thing they have to worry about it, and even there mildly, if they get violent against the demonstrations, if the demonstrations go on, and which might force the military to use more than water cannons, what they've been using up to now against the demonstrators. But that's about it. Anything else? On anything that that you're interested in this week? Last week, I'm going to bring up something myself. Last week, I think it was Barbara, asked me about the situation in Russia with Navalny and whether the Putin regime was in any way, shape, or fashion threatened by the demonstration for the release of Navalny. And I said to her, to you, to all of you, that I don't believe so, because the demonstrations were too small and too limited for the Russian government to react or to worry. about its control on power. And so far, it seems that I was right. There are still demonstrations in Russia. Navalny is in jail. All the foreign pressure to bear on the Russians only led to Russian official protest by the Russian Foreign Ministry and the spokesman for Putin, accusing Western countries and the United States of interfering in the internal affairs of Russia, and even going as far as saying all this time during Trump's presidency, we were accused of hacking or cyber attacking or interfering in the American elections with no proof whatsoever. And here we have perfect proof that the West is interfering with our internal affairs. As a matter of fact, for your information, on Friday, diplomats from Germany, Sweden, and there is a third country in Europe, were sent back home. They were sent packing by the Kremlin, because a few diplomats of all these embassies in Moscow were picked up by the police because they are part of the the embassies in Moscow say that is not true. They are there just as observers. And the Russians are saying, no, those diplomats were there to film, and they were participating in demonstrations against the Russian government. So it's an obvious and flagrant interference of foreign countries. There are no American diplomats. There are some European diplomats, German, Swedish, and a third country. So the Russian police picked them up, and they're going to be sent back home right away. With Russia saying, if we had done that when you have demonstrations against your government back in your countries, in Sweden or in Germany, you would be screaming against Russia's interference. So this is number one. Number two, again, with the Russia situation, there are differences of opinion, again, between Germany and France. Macron suggested last week to impose further sanction of individuals in Russia who are close to Putin because of Navalny's detention. Germany doesn't really, within the European Union, obviously, is not particularly favorable for sanctions, because there are still 120 kilometers of this famous Nord Stream pipeline, which is being built now between Russia and Germany, and which will bring natural gas from Russia to Germany. So on the one hand, they put the Germans in a very difficult situation. On the one hand, obviously, they signed all kinds of joint statements protesting Navalny's arrest and asking for his release. But when it comes to sanctions, Germany is rather reluctant. Because obviously, no matter what, this project obviously there are countries like the United States, which would like to replace Russia by sending its liquid gas to Germany, and other Western European countries within the European Union are pressuring Germany to adopt a common line on Russia. Germany, the leading economic power in Europe, says not so fast. Okay, we have, and that you see that every country, European Union or not European Union, has its own national narrow interests, selfish interests. So Germany will not do anything against Russia at the present time because of the pipeline. From Susan, it seems that Israel has been testing a COVID cure. The small test resulted in 29 hospitalized people being released as cured within 2 days. The last person was released later, a very hopeful situation. Hopefully. I don't know about this. I know that Israel is very advanced in the vaccination campaign. Now, it remains to be seen how this is going to work also. And it's only in a few months that we are going to have a clearer picture of how efficient the vaccine is, and we'll need even more time. When I say we, the pharmaceutical industry will need even more time to assess for how long this immunity will last. Because now the doctors are, as usual, they have different opinions on that. Some say 3 months, some say 6 months, some say we might need a vaccine every year. Some say, well, this vaccine is not very efficient for the South African or Brazilian variant. So there are different opinions, and it remains, or the British variant also, there are different opinions, and we just have to wait and see. There is no other solution. It's impossible, considering what the situation is today, to just open up all the countries and to say, let's go back to work as it was usual. And that would be a huge risk if the things do not go well. On the other hand, it's impossible also to lock down every economy for much longer, because people are getting to the point where I think psychologically also with so much uncertainty and not really knowing when, there is no deadline, there is no we used to say last year, if you remember, almost a year ago, oh, by the summer, it will be warm outside and the vaccine will disappear. In the fall, we'll be back to normal. Well, unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. And a year later, except for the vaccine, which is a great breakthrough, but it's still not a guarantee. And it cannot be a guarantee because it's too new. The medical world has not had the time to see what side effects are there, if there are any, if you're immune or how you are immune. Do you still transmit the virus or not? Can you still get it, and under which form? So there are still too many questions with the vaccine also. But there is something that it's a new stage, but it's definitely not a breakthrough yet. And to have a breakthrough, I'm afraid that we might have to wait a little longer. And I realize for all the countries are in the same position. Now, there are countries where the vaccination campaign has been going faster, have been ahead of other countries. But they are still, speaking of Israel, I spoke with a friend of mine who lives there yesterday, not later than yesterday, and he was telling me that despite all that, and he received the vaccine himself, the 2 vaccines actually. Despite all that, there are still people who have received the vaccine, and there are still people dying in Israel with, I don't know, there are still 20 cases a day or 30 cases a day, which is huge for a country of 9 million. So there is not much to do, and there is a lot of pressure, political pressure, on different governments to act. For instance, France has decided not to lock down again. Obviously, there is curfew, the restaurants are closed, there is curfew after 6 p.m. Before it was 8 p.m., now it's 6 p.m. since January, and it seems, statistically speaking, that the number of cases are still increasing. So the 2 hours of curfew a day haven't seemed to have done a much difference. So there was pressure on Macron last week to lock down, to confine again to the country. And he has decided that politically that wasn't feasible. And it's a sort of hybrid situation in France, where there is no total confinement, but again, there is curfew. France closed its borders with the other members of the European Union. Before, the other members of the European Union could travel freely within the European Union. That's over, for France anyway. But the numbers are still increasing. So he's taking a huge responsibility, because if next week, he said, I'm waiting for the time being to see how things are developing. If by next week the number of cases go up again, he will be forced to lock down the country, and accused of not having done so 2 weeks earlier. So damn if you do, damn if you don't. From Alan, can you comment on US drawbacks on military assistance to Saudi Arabia? Well, as you can tell, one of the immediate actions that the Biden administration took was to say that the US stopped delivering offensive weapons to military, to Saudi Arabia, not defensive. Now, they'll have to explain exactly what they mean by the difference between offensive and defense. I guess that what it means is that the military campaign by Saudi Arabia in Yemen received logistical assistance, from the United States via satellite and other ways, drones, satellites, and other ways to find the Houthis and to help anyway the Saudi jets to be more accurate in their bombing in Yemen. Probably that part will be discontinued, but Saudi Arabia will continue receiving arms from the United States. So to say that, obviously during the campaign, as I expected, the Biden administration, not himself so much, but the Biden administration was making a point that Trump had never stopped helping the Saudis despite Khashoggi's fate, and that the Democrats, once back in the White House, they are going to change their position. They have changed it without really changing it. They will be probably, they will not, also I think the Americans were helping the Saudi jets by loading fuel while in the air, going and coming from Saudi Arabia into Yemen and from Yemen to Saudi Arabia. That will be discontinued, I guess. The US will not help with that. And again, logistically speaking, the US will stop helping the Saudis. But there is no question that they will continue selling arms to Saudi Arabia. Because if they don't sell arms, someone else will. It's as simple as that. And whether it's Biden administration or Trump administration, whoever administration it is, Saudi Arabia is a very important ally for the United States, and that's a fact. No matter who's in the White House and who has a majority in the Congress. Anything else? Okay, so I guess we're running out of questions. Everything is crystal clear for the next 2 weeks, because as you know, we won't see each other next week. It's February. I was going to say it's Valentine's Day. It's February 15th, so we have a break and we get together again on the 22nd. These 2 weeks might give time to the technical teams to to fix the issue and to be able to come in the normal way. All right. So I wish you a very safe couple of weeks, and then I see you on the 22nd. All of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.